In the first part of this three-part look at background issues for the study of the history of biblical Israel, we considered some of the philosophical and presuppositional issues that shape the way people interpret data. In this second and the third part of this study, we'll look at how we go about dating material from the past and how we construct chronology. In this part, we're going to focus on that kind of information that we call relative dating material. In the third part, we'll look at what we describe as absolute dating material, and then we'll also wrap up with a quick overview of the various periods of ancient Near Eastern history. Let's turn now to the question of how we go about determining a date for events in the biblical record and in the ancient world in general. So how do we date events in the ancient world? As we begin, we should recognize that Christians have not always been interested very much in the history of the Bible. After all, for many centuries, an allegorical approach dominated the interpretation of the Bible. And if you see the Bible as an allegory, if you understand the text as just a way of communicating spiritual truths in an allegorical or metaphorical way, then history doesn't matter all that much. It doesn't matter if things actually happened or not. But several things came together to contribute to an increased belief that it was valuable to understand the history of the Old Testament. One of these factors was the kind of approach to interpretation, or the hermeneutic, that grew out of the Reformation. The Reformation largely rejected allegory as a primary means of interpreting biblical texts and focused on the literal meaning of the text. And that led to a renewed interest in the historical claims of the Bible, because the Bible claims that God is at work in, with, and under the events of history to accomplish His will through Israel. So the rise of a Reformation hermeneutic has contributed to a renewed interest in biblical history. A second factor alongside the Reformation hermeneutic is the Renaissance in general in Western Europe. The Renaissance led to an increased interest in ancient languages and ancient history in general, having nothing particularly to do with the Bible, but just in general. And this had a carryover effect. Those who were interested in the ancient world and in ancient languages became increasingly interested in the ancient world as it was revealed in the Bible. The third factor that contributed to a renewed interest in the history of the Bible was European colonial expansion, because as explorers from England and Spain and France and other countries, Germany, traveled to the Far East and the Middle East and around the world in general, they became interested in knowing about other cultures besides their own. And in particular, when they came into contact with those countries and those places mentioned in the Bible, they became especially interested in the history of the Bible. So the combination of the rise of a Reformation hermeneutic that emphasized the importance of the literal meaning of the text and the historical meaning of the text, combined with a general interest in ancient languages and ancient history coming from the Renaissance, and increased exposure to the biblical lands that came with European colonial expansion, all came together to create a renewed interest in the history of the Bible and the history of the lands told in the Bible. And this led in turn to the development of archaeology, because when Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, if I remember correctly, he carried along with him a whole bevy of scholars who weren't there for military reasons. They were there to collect information about the world of ancient Egypt and to bring it back to France. And this event, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and the scholars who went along with him, is typically regarded as the beginning of modern archaeology. So along with the Reformation hermeneutic, the Renaissance, and the expansion of European colonial interest, exposing them to the biblical world, all of these things led to the beginning of the development of archaeology as a science. Now, when it comes to dating events in the Bible, we have to take into account two different kinds of information that come to us from the ancient world. On one hand, we have information that supplies us with relative dates. And by relative dates, we mean things like we would encounter in the sentence, in the first year of King John, so-and-so happened. And then later on, we might read, in the third year of King John, something else happened. So we can work out a scheme of the history of John's reign and understand that event B happened 2 years after event A, but we can't yet assign a specific date to those events. All of the chronological information from the Bible is in the form of relative dates. The other kind of chronological information that we encounter are absolute dates. Absolute dates are dates expressed in the form of a number. So we might get a statement like, in 1492, X happened. So we can pin that down to a specific time on the calendar. That's what we mean by an absolute date. So the challenge is how we relate those two, how we relate the absolute dating material that we can generate with the relative dates that we encounter in the Bible and also in most ancient Near Eastern writings outside the Bible. We've already mentioned that when it comes to the history of Israel, we have to decide how we're going to handle the balance between internal data and external data. So before we move on to some of the other issues, we probably should take a moment to look at perhaps the most famous of the internal dating schemes that are built on what the Bible says only, without really taking into account any external material. The most famous of these was developed by an English scholar named John Lightfoot, who was a professor at Cambridge University in England, and also Archbishop James Ussher, who I think was the Anglican bishop of Dublin in Ireland in the late 17th century. So Ussher and Lightfoot kind of came to a conclusion about the chronology of ancient Israel, and their chronology was printed in King James Bibles beginning in 1701 and handed down from 1701 till the modern period. And so many people just took it for granted that their chronology was correct because it was printed there with the Bible. So what does the Lightfoot-Ussher chronology say? Well, just to give a couple of examples. According to that chronology, creation happened on Sunday, the 23rd of October, 4004 BC. You may have heard the date 4004 BC as the date given for creation. Ussher and Lightfoot actually disagreed a little bit on this point. Lightfoot maintained that creation happened at 9 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, whereas Ussher maintained that it happened at sunset. I have no idea why Lightfoot adopted for the 9 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time for the creation of the world. I assume Ussher opted for sunset because of the Jewish tradition that the day begins at sunset. So probably that explains why he had creation happen at sunset. Well, to give some other examples, according to their chronology, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden happened on the 10th of November, 4004 BC, roughly 2 weeks after the creation of the world. Noah would have landed on Mount Ararat on Wednesday, May the 5th, 2491 BC, obviously. So what can we say about internal dating schemes like that of Lightfoot and Ussher? And by the way, we should add that Lightfoot and Ussher are not the only ones to come up with an internal dating scheme. There are other scholars in the same period and earlier and later who have come up with competing schemes, but they didn't have the advantage of being printed in King James Bibles for several hundred years, and so haven't been as well known. But in general, one of the advantages of internal dating schemes is that they provide very good faithfulness to the biblical record. Since they're drawn entirely from the biblical record, it shouldn't surprise us that they would be relatively faithful to the biblical record. Another thing about internal dating schemes is they often ignore the fact that there are internal consistency problems within the biblical dates themselves. For example, one biblical author may give a round number date with a general thing like 20 years or 25 years or 400 years. Another author may give a much more specific date. And so these dates seem sometimes to be in conflict with one another. And the question is not simply whether we accept that or not, but how do we deal with the internal consistency issues when constructing a chronology. And not all of those who develop an internal biblical chronology come to the same conclusions about how to deal with those internal consistency problems, and that's one reason that these dates differ. Another problem with internal dating schemes is that they just require numerous guesses. There are places where the biblical record, if you will, has gaps with regard to time. We're not given chronological information. And so the interpreter has to come to some conclusion on his own about how long these events might have taken. And he builds those guesses, if you will, into his chronology and tries to make everything fit. So while internal dating schemes provide good faithfulness to the biblical record, they often aren't entirely clear about how they're handling the problems of the internal consistency, and they're not clear about when they're guessing and the criteria that they use for understanding how long things took place when the Bible itself doesn't tell us how long they took. There are other sources outside the Bible that contribute to our understanding of biblical chronology. So, for example, from Egypt, we have the very famous king list by the 3rd century Egyptian priest Manetho. Manetho was a priest who examined the history of Egypt through the sources that were available to him and produced a list of 31 dynasties into which the various kings were fitted. And today we know that Manetho's king list is not complete, and it's not entirely accurate either. Now, we probably can't blame Manetho for this, because one of the things that we've learned is that some of the kings of Egypt intentionally tried to erase all record of their predecessors. They didn't want their predecessors to exist even, so they tried to wipe them out of existence by eliminating them from the historical record. And Manetho didn't know about those, didn't have that material available to him, and so he doesn't include some of those kings in his list. But also his own activity as he assembled this list is flawed in some ways, so it's not, even what he has is not entirely accurate as we know today. However, we do have to say this, that Manetho's king list is really the foundation for our understanding of the dating of Egyptian history, and it remains a very important foundational document for developing a chronology of the biblical lands in biblical times. From Mesopotamia, we have some other kinds of documentary evidence. We have what we call the Assyrian eponym lists. The Assyrians, in their calendars, would name a year after a particular person, and there's a list of the names or the persons for whom the years were named. These are the eponym lists as we know them today. We also have lists of kings from Babylon. In addition, from across the ancient Near East, we have a variety of royal annals and records that help us to reconstruct, to a certain degree, the events of the history of the ancient Near East. Another kind of data that we have that helps us to reconstruct the history of the ancient world would be things like economic texts that record years of economic activity. And that not only gives us chronological information, it also gives us information about Egypt's economy and the way people lived. Probably the most important kind of external data when it comes to developing a chronology of the ancient world comes in the form of pottery. Now, you may wonder what pottery has to do with developing a biblical chronology. Well, pottery, as it turns out, is very valuable to us. And one of the reasons that it's valuable is how widespread it was. After 6000 BC or so, pottery becomes very widespread in its use after 6000 BC. So we find it everywhere in the ancient world. Another thing about pottery is that it's durable. Now, the pots may break, but the shattered pieces will remain, and they can be found and in some cases even reassembled. So pottery is durable, unlike, say, documents written on papyrus or on leather, which may decay. Generally, pottery remains, continue, without being destroyed. But the real thing about pottery that helps us use it for dating is the fact that the decoration of pottery and the way the pottery was made develops over time. And as a result, there are distinctive styles that can be identified. Just like someone, for example, who might know a lot about cars might be able to look at a fender or a bumper and say, oh, look, that comes from a 1957 Chevy Impala. I don't know if they made Impalas in 1957 or not, but they might be able to identify what car it came from, at least what model car it came from, by the shape and the color and even the construction of the part that's found. And that's what happens with pottery. The recognition and the discovery that there are distinctive types of pottery that change and develop over time and in different places has made it possible for us to follow those developments and to identify a site and clarify its date based on the pottery that we find there. And so the important elements are the distinction in pottery types and also the fact that pottery was traded between regions, because this helps us to establish cross-references between dates that we can identify in one place, and that will help us to date material in another place as well. Well, let's look at an example of the way that pottery dating works. This is an amphora, which is primarily a large storage jar, found from Turkey in the 5th century BC. Notice the little pointy bottom that it has. People look at amphoras and they say, well, why would they make a pot that way? It seems to be impractical because it wouldn't stand up very well. Well, actually, they dealt with this by digging a little hole and setting the point of the amphora down in the hole so that it was stable. So here in this drawing of an archaeological site up in the upper right-hand corner, we have what's described as a cup mark. This is very likely the place where probably a smaller amphora was placed and stood there as a storage jar for water or wine or perhaps grain or whatever they would choose to store in it. So going back to this 5th century Turkish amphora, let's compare this with a Canaanite amphora. This one from a much earlier period, roughly 2000 BC. Now notice they look a lot alike, but if you look carefully, you'll see that there are significant differences. For example, the collar of the pot is different. The one on the left, the Turkish amphora, has a more angular collar, whereas the one on the right, the Canaanite amphora, is more rounded and it's smaller. The neck style is also different. The length of the neck, the shape of the neck, the thickness of the neck all vary from one type of amphora to another. We also have different type handles. The one on the left has handles that are called stirrup handles up high on the top of the pot like this, whereas the Canaanite amphora has handles on the side, sometimes called shoulder handles. We've already mentioned the pointy bottom, and it might be worth noting here that the point differs. The Canaanite amphora doesn't have that knob on the bottom that we see in the case of the Turkish amphora. Archaeologists will also take samples of the actual material, the clay from which the pot is made, and that will help us to identify the source of the pot in case the pot has been moved from one place to another as a result of trade or everyday use. Also, finally, an important element is how the pot is glazed. Glazing is a part of the decoration of a pot. Here you can see the pottery on the right has a much shinier glaze than the one on the left, which is more matte and doesn't stand out and reflect as much light. Here are some examples of different types of pottery. This pottery is monochrome pottery from the Philistines, also known as the Sea Peoples. This is from the biblical city of Ekron, which is known today as Tel Mikne, and is dated to the first third of the 12th century. So this would be in the period of the Judges in the Old Testament times. Here's a different type of Philistine pottery from a probably slightly later period and a different town. And you can see that whereas the other pottery was decorated with just one type of paint, this is bichrome. There are this kind of reddish brown, but there are also blacks here that are used to decorate this pot. So we have two colors, not just one. We also have a more sophisticated pattern of decoration, including the ducks, which the Philistines just loved for some reason. This is a kind of pottery known as wild goat. Wild goat is a Greek form of pottery, and this particular pot came from the eastern part of Greece. But the important thing about it is that it was found in an archaeological layer of the destroyed city of Ashkelon at a date that has been identified as roughly 604. So this would have been after the fall of Samaria, before the fall of Jerusalem. So the importance here is that we have Greek pottery that's in Ashkelon. So that tells us that trade was happening between Greece and the Philistines. The trade may have been direct or it may have been indirect, but nevertheless it was happening so that the pottery could come and be found at Ashkelon, even though its source is in Greece. Speaking of Greece, this is an example of a classical type plate that we call kylix. Kylix is the style of decoration, but I show this to you just to illustrate how different this is from the other kind of wild goat pottery that we saw from Greece. This is Israelite pottery. The Israelites did not produce pottery that was all that sophisticated, frankly. So this is from the period from about 1200 to about 1000. So toward the end of the period would be, in the time of David. So in the Judges, Saul and David. Notice how plain this pottery is. The Israelites did not, so far as we know, produce pottery with the kind of lovely decorations that the Philistines had. Here we have two individuals who are engaged in excavating a pot, and you can see that they're reassembling this pot as they put it together. The reason they're doing this is because you almost always find pottery that's broken. It's rare to find an unbroken large piece of pottery that's whole and intact, unless that pottery has been placed into a tomb. When pots are used as tomb or burial goods, then they often survive intact, but otherwise they're mostly broken and in pieces and have to be reassembled. When you find a big piece of pottery, you're usually pretty happy about it, and it's exciting to find a large piece, even if the large piece isn't entirely complete. Here we have a picture of the pottery from just 1 or 2 days in one archaeological site in 1 year. And each of these containers contains pottery shards or broken pieces of pottery from a particular place in the excavation and at a particular level. So all the pottery in each of these containers goes together, at least in terms of where it was found. So most likely, if you're going to reassemble a pot, the pieces for it would be in one of these, and maybe in the ones found on each side of it. That's why record keeping is particularly important in archaeology. So we have all of these different styles of pottery, and people have taken great pains to analyze these and also to record them, so that we end up with books that look like this, pages and pages of pottery types with their general outline indicated. Because let's face it, if you find a piece of broken pottery from the middle somewhere that doesn't have any significant decoration on it, it's probably not worth much for establishing date. So what you tend to look for are pieces that have some distinctive element, like a curve or decoration, or that they're part of an identifiable kind of pot or place on the pot, like the collar or the neck, because those help us to identify where the pot comes from and what kind of pot it is, in a way that a simple wall or base piece might not. Here's an example of some Canaanite pottery. This is bichrome pottery from the 12th to the 11th century. So coming in now during the reign of Saul and David, to follow the biblical narrative. This is a crater. A crater is a large bowl for pouring wine and water and mixing them in. Here we have a pot or container that's used for pouring wine. And notice the holes in the spout. That's because in biblical times, when they made wine or beer, it wasn't filtered, so that if you're making wine, you might have the wine skins and the seeds and perhaps pieces of branches or leaves floating around in it. And they just leave those there. And finally, when it comes to serving it, it can be poured into something like this. And then when it's poured out, the holes serve as a colander to kind of strain out the gunk that's left floating on top of the wine or the beer. They both had that kind of layer of the artifacts of the manufacturing process, we might say. That explains why the little holes are there on the spout. Down here we have a drinking bowl. It looks a little bit like a crater, but in a smaller size, and this particular one has a different kind of base. Here, a stirrup jar. Again, that's the style of handles. And this one was used for oil-based perfumes or ointments. Oil-based things were very common in the biblical world. And finally, a perfume bottle. Again, the perfume would be made from probably oil that had aromatic berries or juices or leaves or flowers or whatever, and ground up and mixed with it. So all of that helps to explain why pottery sequencing is such an important part of the way that we date events in the biblical world.